We'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. My name is Sarah Pierce. I am the Housing and Energy Affordability Program Coordinator here at the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. I oversee our utility affordability program called EveryHome, which seeks to include affordable utilities into the affordable housing conversation. Typically, on the fourth Tuesday of every month, we host a webinar that is related to affordable utilities and housing. So today, we will be discussing our most recent report. It just came out about a month ago. It is called Affordability Beyond the Rent: Utilities and the True Cost of Housing in Louisville, Kentucky. This report was written in collaboration with the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, with who we have here today, and they are going to speak to us about the findings in their report. On the call today, we have Dr. William Bryan, Dr. Amy Lovell, and Laura Diaz-Villacuran. So just a little bit about all of our speakers before we begin. Will Bryan serves as SEEA's Director of Research, where he leads a research team focused on advancing equitable energy policies through mixed methods of research, geospatial analysis, and storytelling. Amy Lovell joined the research team at SEEA in 2024 and is SEEA's Senior Research Associate. She brings wealth of expertise in planetary science and solar energy research. And Laura Diaz-Villacuran is a research associate at SEEA, where she leads a range of projects focused on geospatial analysis, data analysis, and stakeholder engagement. So today they will be talking to us about the findings in our report, which you can find on our website. We will put the link in the chat. And if you could, please hold questions toward the end, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. I will go ahead and turn it over to Will, Amy, and Laura.
There's the mute button. Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here with y'all today. We're really excited to talk about some of the findings that we developed over the course of about 6 months of working with MHC and other stakeholders in Louisville, and excited to talk about some solutions to this very pressing issue of utility affordability. Before we dive in, just a little bit of background on SEEA. The Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, or SEEA, is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia, but we work across 12 southern states in 5 U.S. island territories, primarily doing research and policy work around energy efficiency. And in that capacity, we support a variety of decision makers, community-based organizations, and other stakeholders, really to both kind of outline needs and identify solutions to those needs throughout our region that are founded on equitable energy efficiency and residential upgrades, as we're going to be talking about today. And to that end, I think I want to start with some general context, which you've probably all seen in the news, but I feel like just over the last 3 or 4 months, utility costs have been in the news more than I've ever seen at any point in the last decade. It's really actually quite incredible that utility costs are kind of at the center of so many national conversations, and I think rightly so. This is a very small sample of headlines just from the past month or two. But I think kind of what undergirds a lot of this is that we're seeing utility prices climbing and putting strain on household budgets in ways that are becoming really stark. This is due to a combination of factors, and we're going to talk about some of those today. To some extent, this is due to the rapid demand for large quantities of energy and water from new industrial and commercial sources. I think data centers are a good example of this. It's also, due in part to disinvestment from kind of long established programs that have been designed to mitigate household needs through bill assistance or through weatherization. And at the same time, we have aging housing infrastructure, aging water and energy infrastructure, and all of that kind of has combined to create this moment when utility costs are rising quickly in many parts of the country and straining household budgets more than they have in the past. And I think, it's a really critical moment to be having the conversations that we're going to be having today. And I think it's important to stress too, particularly for work in Kentucky, that these impacts historically and, currently have an outsized role in the South. This is a map showing the proportion of households in every state who are energy insecure, which means that they struggle from month to month to pay their bills, to maintain access to energy. And you can see a much higher proportion of households in the South are energy insecure than in almost any other part of the country, ranging from about a quarter of households in the South in some states like Virginia to 40% in Mississippi, excuse me. In Kentucky, about 1 out of every 3 households struggles with energy insecurity, struggles to pay the bills from month to month. That's about 570,000 households. So we're talking, a couple of million people who are struggling from month to month. And as utility costs become more of a factor in their overall household budgets, as costs rise, this is only going to get worse and become, more difficult to make ends meet, force households to make difficult choices between paying their utility bills and, paying for other necessary expenses. And so, we're, as a region, the South is already struggling with these issues. And I think what we want to talk about today is some of the potential impacts that current utility affordability strains may have on households throughout our region, but specifically today in Louisville. And just to kind of put a little bit of a finer point on that very quickly, this is a chart that shows the proportion of households in each region who experience each of these kind of symptoms of energy insecurity. And you can see that in almost every category aside from one, the South has a higher proportion of households, and Kentucky is included in that Southern distinction here by the Census Bureau, than in any other part of the country. And so, what energy insecurity actually looks like on the ground is, about 7% of households across the South just simply cannot use their air conditioning equipment, either because it's too expensive or because it's broken and they cannot afford to repair it. About 4% of households cannot use heating equipment for the same reasons. About 12% of households in our region have received a disconnection notice or a stop service notice. About 10% have had to leave their home at an unhealthy temperature over the past year because they cannot afford their bills. Almost a quarter of all households have had to reduce or totally forego their consumption of food or medicine to pay for their utility bills. And again, about 30% of households across the South experience energy insecurity, with Kentucky being higher than that at 33%. So with that, we're going to dig into the data on Louisville, and we're going to think about what do these issues look like in Louisville. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Amy, to talk you through that.
Thank you, Will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the energy landscape to begin with. So just so that we're all on the same page, you probably all are familiar with these terms. The term energy burden we use to describe the ratio of the energy cost to the household income. And if that exceeds a threshold of 6%, that would be considered unaffordable. And so if you just look at all the households in Louisville, about 4.5% energy burden is the average for all households. And so that would be beneath that unaffordable threshold. However, if you look at the low and moderate income households who are at or below the 80% level of the area median income, that average energy burden is 8.2%. So that's nearly twice as high as for all households. And that does indicate some pretty significant affordability challenges, which is what we're here to talk about. So just by the numbers, 57,000 households in Louisville have energy burdens that qualify as high, so over the 6% threshold. And 27,000 of those households have energy burdens over 10%, which would be considered severe. Thank you. So we want to look at the distribution of those energy burdens. So this is a histogram where they're in 3% ranges. So 3%, less than 3%, 3 to 6%, 6 to 10%, and greater than 10%. Well, those aren't exactly 3%, sorry. So if you look at those red bars, that is all the households in the Louisville area. And so what you see is that the majority of all households are in the affordable range under that 6% unaffordability threshold. But if you look at the blue bars, that is just the incomes in the lower than 80% AMI, the low and median income households. And you see a very different distribution. It's much flatter, and there are a lot more households on the right-hand side of that graph in the 6 to 10% and the greater than 10% area. And I'll just point out that if you look at the numbers here, there are more individual households in each of the groups, high and severe, than there are in the affordable group below 3%. Okay, thank you. So one of the things we want to do is we want to look at the breakdown by those income categories, because it is very clear that at the lowest income range, 0 to 30% of the area median income, those lowest income households really experience a very severe energy burden at 13.7%. And again, that remember that means they're spending 13.7% of their household income just on energy. And so that speaks a lot to an energy affordability problem. In Louisville, the top 20% of households earn 16% more than the bottom 20% of households. And that gap has been widening since 2020. So that really speaks to something that, and this severe energy burden is 3 times higher than the overall approximately, and it's twice the low income energy burden in general. And so that lowest group is going to be really important for us to focus on. Go on to the next one. And so if we look at the costs, again, these are the same groups, the 0 to 30% up to 150% plus of the area median income. It is true that the lowest income households do spend less on their energy than the highest income households. There's a difference of about $94 per month on average from the lowest group to the highest group. That's about 43%. Now, the difference of 43% is very much smaller than the factor of 5 or more in the income between those two groups. And so what that says is, though the lowest income households are spending less, it is not aligned with the difference in income. And that suggests a lot about energy affordability. This could be among several things, that those bills are lower perhaps because lower income households may live in smaller square footage, for example. They may have a greater urgency to conserve energy. They may have coping strategies that limit their use of energy. Or by contrast, the higher income households may live in larger homes, or they may have more appliances or more devices that are using energy in their homes. And by contrast, they're also more likely to be able to afford efficient equipment, such as efficient appliances. And that's going to tend to squeeze that gap between the lowest and the highest income groups. Okay. So let's look at the geography a little bit then. If you map the energy burden, so now it's in scales of darker shades of red being higher energy burdens, lighter shades are lower energy burdens. If we look at all of the residents, the highest energy burdens citywide are in central Louisville, so west of the downtown core in these areas that are shown in darker red. Whereas if you go to the next one, we'll see for low income households below 80% of the area median, those high and severe energy burdens are pervasive. Everywhere in the city, people in low and moderate income categories are experiencing high energy burdens. Next one, please. So unaffordable energy is not just about income, though income is a major driver. It can be driven by the quality and the efficiency of the housing and the access to efficient building technologies. In 2024, the National Renewable Energy Lab made a study and found that 70% of homes on average in Louisville have a poor building envelope. So that's a key factor in the efficiency of buildings that describes how well sealed or how well insulated the exterior of the home is. And low-income households were found by this study by National Renewable Energy Lab to be much more likely to live in homes with a poor building envelope than the higher income households. So what we're showing in this map and something called the energy use intensity, which is taking out the factor that we were talking about with the size of the home. So how much energy is used per square foot by the household in that location. And this method found that, again, the homes in central Louisville there have the highest energy use intensity. So their energy uses are high per square foot. So that kind of normalizes across the city. And that suggests that not only are there real differences in the affordability of energy, the real differences in the energy bills there. And part of that is helping to explain why there may be a small gap between the different income categories. Okay, so now what I want to do is just summarize a little bit. So income, ownership of the building, we didn't talk about that, but the type of building we also didn't talk about, the age of the building. Those are factors that are in the report, which we encourage you to read. All of those influence on affordability, and all of those variables and everything that we found interacts with the identity and race of the residents. And our colleague Laura will now discuss a little bit more about those issues.
Thank you. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, awesome. So the legacy of racial segregation and exclusionary zoning, as well as redlining, has shaped the landscape that we see today in Louisville in terms of housing and affordability challenges. This is a 1930s map from the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation. And these maps were created to assess mortgage lending risk. And so this is focusing on the area of Louisville that was historically redlined. And as you can see, is that western side of Louisville where we see clusters of high energy burdens. And so the way that these grades were given was largely based on the racial makeup of the neighborhoods or the areas that these lenders were looking at. So generally the A, which are the green grades, were deemed the best areas for lending practices, and those are majority white neighborhoods. And then those D areas, which are the red ones, were deemed hazardous and thus had high risk for mortgage lending. And those were primarily Black neighborhoods. And if you go to the next slide, so today, what that translates to is that areas that were labeled as D or hazardous have pretty high to severe energy burdens, while the areas that were labeled A have virtually none. Additionally, I wanted to just highlight that some of the exclusionary zoning practices that we see in Louisville also further reinforce segregation by requiring larger lot sizes, restricting multifamily housing, and mandating low density development in certain areas. And these regulations encourage car-dependent suburban growth and inflating housing costs. And they effectively excluded lower income and minority households from access to new or well-resourced neighborhoods. If you could go to the next slide. So we also mapped out the current energy burden, looking at the Black, Indigenous, or people of color population from the US Census. And what we're seeing here is a bivariate map where we're comparing the average energy burden with a proportion of non-white residents per census tract. And so those areas that are green, like the deep green areas in this map, are areas where we find both numbers to be high, so high energy burden and over 50% of non-white residents. And then overall, we find that 40% of the energy burden census tract in Louisville are in majority BIPOC areas. If you could go to the next slide, please. So here we do, we account for what it would take, what is required to close those affordability gaps in Louisville. And we found that this would require a 33 million annual investment in order for us to close those gaps. And in some of the areas in Western Louisville, we find that we would require more than $700,000 for each household to close those gaps. And now I'll pass it over to Will.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about water because, as we're considering utilities, we're considering both energy and water as part of this report. I think in some ways we see kind of similar numbers when it comes to water. Our kind of takeaway is that tens of thousands of households in Louisville pay more than 4.5% of their income for their water and wastewater combined. And this is kind of the threshold that the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, uses to denote unaffordable water and wastewater costs is when they exceed that 4.5% threshold. And to get to this figure, we used a metric called the income dedicated to water service metric, which essentially estimates the number of households who spend a certain proportion of their income for their water and sewer bills. And here you can see the kind of the chart that we developed to estimate that. The green line are water costs, and the red line are wastewater costs. So here we've disaggregated it to water and wastewater. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of households who pay more than X percentage for their water or their wastewater. And on the x-axis, you can see the percent of income spent on water or wastewater. So to read this chart, you would, look at the x-axis, you would kind of look at the two, and you would say, about 18% of households in Louisville pay more than 2% of their income for their water, and about 30% of households in Louisville pay more than 2% of their income for their wastewater. And so, what we found is that at a typical monthly usage volume, in this case, 4,000 gallons per month, about 17.7% of households across the city, that's about 58,000 households, spend more than 4.5% of their income on water and wastewater combined. As you can see by the kind of shape of these two lines, however, wastewater tends to contribute more to that overall kind of spend than water bills do. And at that level of usage, again, at 4,000 gallons per month, about 10% of households in Louisville pay more than 2.5% of their income for water. That's about 33,000 households, while almost 30% of households, 94,000, would pay more than 2% of their income for wastewater. So you can see there's kind of, wastewater tends to be more of a driver of those bills than water does. And when we look at this spatially, I think the same patterns that we see in energy play out in water. Here we've estimated water and sewer costs, these are combined, as a proportion of the median household income for every census tract across Louisville. And again, this is at a typical household volume of 4,000 gallons per month. I think, what we can see is that, at 4,000 gallons per month, the kind of overall water burden is about 1.6%, which is well below that 4.5% threshold. But that's not true everywhere. That's kind of an aggregate across the city that sort of washes out some of the real affordability challenges that people living in West Louisville and Central Louisville experience. And if you look at this map, you can see that, in many of the census tracts in West Louisville and Central Louisville, households pay, well over 4.5% of their income for their water and sewer costs on average. And in the inset map, you can see kind of what this looks like zoomed in, with some of the highest tracts paying, on average about 11% of their income for water and sewer costs, which is, almost triple the EPA's affordability threshold. And, the kind of chart at the bottom we included because I think it's important to really kind of take stock of which tracts are the most burdened. And here, these are the top 5 census tracts in the city that have the highest water and sewer costs as a percentage of the median household income. And you can see that there are 2 other characteristics that they virtually all have. One is that they have a high proportion of Black residents, over 50% in every case. And one is that they have a high proportion of people in poverty, again, over 50% in every case. So these, one of the things I think we want to stress today is that these are utility costs are are a key issue, but they intersect with many other challenges that people face, and they can magnify those challenges in key ways. And so that, addressing utility unaffordability can be a key strategy to, addressing a wider range of issues that residents of Louisville are faced with. And then one other way of looking at this is looking at the proportion of income spent on water and wastewater bills for the bottom 20% of earners in the city. And again, I think the pattern here is very similar to that low and moderate income map for energy, in that households in the bottom 20% of earners almost everywhere in the city pay more than 4.5% of their income. And in some cases, up to 30% of their income for water and sewer costs. And again, with the inset map, you can see kind of, West Louisville and downtown Louisville, which tend to be the most burdened by these issues. You can see, the percentage is the average percent of income that a household in that census tract, would face for water and sewer costs. And you can see that it's, over 5% in every case, and in some census tracts, it's approaching 13 or 14%. So, I think when we're talking about energy burdens or water and wastewater burdens, it's really important to reflect on who is most at risk, because I think one of the real takeaways from our research in Louisville is that, there is a large swath of people in Louisville who are not at risk. Tens of thousands, 100,000 households, more than that, are not at risk for unaffordable water or wastewater bills. And that's, largely because they have higher incomes, and they, water, wastewater, energy, these are not things that really impact them in the same way that they do more income constrained households. And so when we think about who is most at risk across the city, for energy burdens, one of the things that holds true for both energy and water burdens is income. Income is like the primary factor in unaffordability and ability to pay, your utility bills. So across both energy and water, income is certainly a shared characteristic. But then when we looked to kind of understand how other household characteristics impacted energy burdens and water burdens, we found that, for energy burdens, the households most likely to experience the highest burdens in Louisville are low and moderate income residents living in single-family detached homes, which don't benefit from the kind of efficiencies of scale that you have in multifamily homes, or the kind of, shared building envelope that you have that tends to make multifamily a little bit more efficient than single-family homes. Owner-occupied properties, and I'm going to return to that because, one of the things that we found is that in aggregate, low-income owner-occupied properties tended to experience higher energy burdens than renters. However, I think it's important to note that renters have less access to assistance than homeowners do. And so, as we're considering maybe who experiences these issues and, how to think about solutions, I think it's important to think about both sides of that. We found that homes primarily heated with natural gas had higher energy burdens than homes heated with electricity or other fuels. Older homes, maybe not surprisingly, particularly those that were built before 1980, when the first building energy codes were introduced nationally and in Kentucky, tend to be less efficient. And they, as we showed, with the energy use intensity map, there are these kind of disparities in terms of access to efficient housing throughout the city. And then again, census tracts with greater than 80% minority populations. Much of this holds true on the water side as well, with a couple of, other aspects. One is that older homes with less home improvement spending, and I'll kind of circle back to that point in a few minutes. And then vulnerable age groups also. So either, households with children under 18 or with residents who are older than 65 tend to experience the highest water and wastewater burdens in the city. And, I think it's important to kind of think about what is the impact of utility bills on housing affordability. Because, on the one hand, utility costs are maybe not the prime thought when people think about housing affordability, or not, kind of the key the key thing that we're thinking about. We're thinking about rents or mortgage costs. However, they're a really important aspect in driving housing affordability, either for the better or for the worse. And, so what we did here is we kind of broke down for a minimum wage worker in Louisville, what does, how long do you have to work to pay a typical bill, both for energy and water, every month. And so what we found is that to pay a typical energy bill, monthly energy bill, a minimum wage worker in Louisville would need to work about 19 and a half hours per month, just for that one bill. To pay a typical water bill, a minimum wage worker would need to work about 4.4 hours a month. And then for a wastewater bill, it's about 9 hours a month. And so what that adds up to is, if you are a minimum wage worker in Louisville, for working for full days of work a month, are spent only paying your utility bills. And when we think about kind of what ripple effects that has on other aspects of folks' lives, that means it's more difficult to save. That means it's more difficult to build wealth through housing. That means it's maybe you have to make trade-offs and lower costs in other places, either say food or medicine, to make it by from month to month. And I think the other thing to note about this is that this is kind of an idealized portrait. Like, this is best case scenario, really, because one thing we know about energy costs in particular is that they are varied from month to month. And in some months you may have a low bill, but in other months you may have a bill that's double or triple. And so these kind of labor allocations per month can really vary depending on the time of year and the bills that you're getting. And for a lot of low-income residents, for any resident really, it's very difficult to predict that in advance. And it's sometimes very difficult to budget for that because it's hard to know from month to month or from year to year what your household energy and water costs may be. And so, I think as we're talking about this, it's sort of important to know too that in some months you may have to spend 8 days a month if your bill doubles because it's really cold. Whereas in other months it may be less. And so, the kind of unpredictability of the bills, I think, makes it quite difficult in some cases to really budget in ways that would be conducive long-term spending. Okay, so I think we want to kind of talk a little bit too about some of the broader impacts that these issues have. Energy and water are both essential household needs, and the financial burdens that many households in Louisville face can really foreclose opportunities for these households to achieve housing stability and accumulate wealth. As I said, these costs are really uncertain and variable, and renters and homeowners may have little insight into what utility costs might be with a home before choosing to live there. It's one of the things that doesn't necessarily show up in the MLS when you go to rent or buy a home. And so that can really strain a household's ability to budget and plan. And just on the energy side, a pair of scholars have found that energy burdened communities have a 150 to 200% greater risk of falling into or staying in economic poverty. So there are kind of these broad ripple effects that these bills, which maybe are not the bulk of it, which is a minute S. Because I think this is particularly pertinent in Kentucky, as there have been some proposals floated to eliminate LIHEAP, which provides a key source of bill assistance and emergency support for households who are struggling with their energy costs. And just wanted to highlight, this is a chart of the number of households in every state since 2016 who have either avoided a service disconnection or been reconnected thanks to LIHEAP assistance. And, I think it's important to note that Kentucky leads the nation almost every year and in aggregate. Since 2016, LIHEAP has prevented or ended 1.25 million disconnections across the state, more than any other part of the country, which is pretty incredible. And so the loss of a program like this I think is really potentially going to have severe impacts on, people's ability to make it through, both emergencies and, periods of extreme heat and extreme cold. Okay. So, I want to kind of wrap up here and talk a little bit about, what we can do about this. I think it's important that we view all of this as systemic issues. No single recommendation that we have outlined in our report can solve energy insecurity or water affordability problems themselves. It really requires close coordination among all advocates, utilities, service providers, local governments, and more. And so, we need to think about these as system level challenges and, kind of try to solve them in that way. So, when I talk about kind of the recommendations here, I think it's important to view it in that light. And in our report, we lay out a series of kind of 6 categories of recommendations, each of which has a couple of specific recommendations under it. So one category is we need to see more programs to address at-risk housing. This is old housing. This is housing with seniors. This is housing with critical repair problems. So, some of our recommendations in this vein involve establishing a critical repair and home maintenance fund for homes that maybe are not in disrepair, but are headed in that direction. Some of our recommendations include adopting municipal policies to improve existing buildings. It's very difficult to touch existing buildings through the policies that exist on the books today. And as well as updating the state residential energy code and improving compliance with existing codes that, shape the efficiency and quality of new housing across the state. Another category is programs to address at-risk renter households. As I mentioned kind of earlier in the presentation, it's very difficult for renters to access assistance, particularly weatherization assistance that can reduce energy and water costs in the long term through some sort of kind of free home upgrades. And so, really focusing on renters who are effectively blocked from many programs, I think it's a really crucial strategy. This may involve providing landlord incentives for upgrades or implementing a pay-as-you-save type of a program, which is like an on-bill tariff program, or even expanding access to energy-saving education on energy-saving behaviors for tenants who can benefit from that, I think is another kind of crucial step. Another category, and I think this kind of spans all the categories, is just robust coordination. One of the things that our team has really taken away from this project is that Louisville has a remarkable network of assistance providers working on the ground to support households with energy and water needs. It's really robust, particularly compared to some communities that SEEA works in. And so I think, thinking about how to leverage those assets are really critical, maybe through coordinated fundraising and shared resources for energy and water assistance, through a system of coordinated program entry so that households don't have to go to multiple programs to receive assistance. And they don't have to necessarily, you can kind of coordinate marketing through the same channels, or through automatic enrollment in critical programs that people may be eligible for. Another category is expanding targeted affordability initiatives. And so, in this case, we're talking about expanded utility efficiency programs, both water and energy. Increasing targeting of these programs to the most at-risk customers, maybe those in that 0 to 30% of AMI category, or those who have other issues that make them at risk. New program models, such as a percentage of income payment plan that caps your costs at a certain percentage of your income if you qualify. And then establishing some sort of low-income affordability collaborative and leveraging the real assets that Louisville has in terms of its stakeholder and, assistance network. And then, again, kind of at the utility level, expanding demand-side management as a cost-effective alternative to building new generation and offsetting infrastructure costs through some sort of outside investment. And finally, rate design. rates are, are an important part of affordability, and not one that we get into in this presentation, but one that we talk about in the report. And so, really trying to reduce aspects of rates that are burdensome on low-income customers, and that's particularly fixed fees, which don't incentivize, energy or water conservation behavior, implementing some sort of rate protections for customer classes to ensure that they're not underwriting commercial and industrial discounts. All of this, I think, is, there are a lot of kind of single solutions which can provide key, key benefits across a variety of households in Louisville. But again, I think it's really important here at the end to stress that these are systemic challenges. And I think thinking about them at that kind of system level and thinking about how to coordinate multiple of these recommendations across the city is really going to kind of provide the most opportunity to reduce the burden of energy and water costs for residents of Louisville. So with that, I will wrap up our part of the presentation, and I think we're happy to take a few questions with our remaining time.